This is the Go Maluku podcast.
To start, I want to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Kenneth Deer. Kenneth has been involved in the international indigenous movement since 1987. He first attempted the United Nations Working Group of Indigenous Population. He was involved in the development of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples until it was passed in 2007. He has attended all the working groups on indigenous populations, working groups on the draft of the declaration, the permanent forum, the expert mechanism since 1987. He has also attended many UN World Conferences and also has coordinated and chaired the indigenous caucuses in Geneva and in New York. He's currently the North American member of the Indigenous Coordinating Body and will explain why the enhanced participation process is very important to us indigenous peoples and why it is almost 100 years process, starting with the Descahe traveling to Geneva for the League of Nations. So I have the pleasure to give Mr. Kenneth the floor now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to have the floor. My internet is down here in my community because we had a big rainstorm last night. So I'm using my data and I'm using my iPhone. So I feel a little handicapped right now. So first of all, good morning, everybody. It's 8 o'clock in the morning here where I am. And I want to welcome you all to this process. We after that wonderful introduction, I don't know what to say. The issue of enhanced participation has been, been the goal of Indigenous people since we started coming to the United Nations. And as you know, that in the United Nations, in order to address the United Nations, you have to either be a member state or you have to be a non-governmental organization or an NGO. And Indigenous peoples, we're not non-governments. We are governments in our own right, with our own leadership, our own constitutions, our own laws, our ability to enforce our own laws. We have land, we have territory, we have our own civil society, and so we are governments in our own right, and we have resisted. Many of us have resisted registering in the United Nations as NGOs, and because we feel that's an insult to our people and to our heritage. So what we're in our case, for, say, the Haudenosaunee, it's been 99 years that we've been trying to address the international community. In 1923, we sent a chief, a Cayuga chief, whose title was Descahe. His name was Levi General, and he was one of the chiefs of the 50 chiefs of the Haudenosaunee. In the Haudenosaunee, we are 6 nations actually, made up of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations, and there are, I think there are 10 Cayuga chiefs, and all titles that are handed down to us from time immemorial, so way before European contact. And it's the women in our people that hold the titles, and they are the ones that nominate the chiefs to hold those positions. So the title of Descahe has been handed down from generation to generation to generation by the women of the Cayuga nation, and so the title of Descahe in 1923 was held by a man named Levi General, and the Haudenosaunee was having difficulties with Canada. Of course, we had difficulties with the United States as well, but in this land that Canada has sold out from under us, and we were demanding an accountant at Shawnee. And and we weren't getting any satisfaction from the government of Canada. So the Haudenosaunee decided that we, as a sovereign people, we had every right to go to the League of Nations to talk to the League of Nations, let them know the situation that we were facing in Canada. So Descahe went to Geneva. He made his own. He made a passport in order to. He first went to England first to see the king, but the king refused to see him. So he came back home in 1921. Then he went to the League of Nations in 1923. And when he arrived in the League of Nations, he wanted to address the League, and he was supported by many people. He was very popular in Geneva. They had a real red Indian, and among them, and a lot of the aristocrats in Geneva supported him. The mayor of Geneva and so academics, and some important people, and also some states. For instance, Japan and the Netherlands, who we have a treaty with, supported him, as well as Persia, which is Iran today, and Estonia, apparently. And however, Canada was very, very upset that Descahe was in Geneva, and they were upset that a savage would be there to try to address the League. And Canada wasn't a very big player in the League of Nations, so they asked Great Britain to intervene, and Great Britain convinced the League to not to allow Descahe to speak of the League. So they stopped him from speaking, and which was disingenuous because many people addressed the League of Nations that were not members. So Descahe said, "Well, okay, I'm not a member, so therefore I will apply to be a member." So he went through the formal process of applying to be members of the League of Nations, for the Haudenosaunee to be members of the League, and in 1924. And however, through subterfuge, the League of Nations never considered his application, even though the rules are very clear that anybody who applies for admission to the League, their application must be brought to the floor for a vote. And because of the influence of Great Britain and some others, the secretary of the League never brought the application to the floor for a vote. I presume for fear that Haudenosaunee might win the vote, I suppose. So anyway, his application was never approved. In the meantime, though, in Canada was so upset with Descahe being in Canada, being in the League in Geneva, trying to address the League of Nations. On October 10th of 2000, the government invaded the community of Six Nations, the Six Nations territory, and they raided the council house of the chiefs and clan mothers, and they confiscated all the wampums and symbols of authority, the files, and shipped them off to Ottawa, padlocked the council house, and had elections to have another kind of government among the Haudenosaunee. And that was a coup. The Canadian government had a coup to overthrow the Haudenosaunee at that time. In the Descahe left Geneva, and he never returned home because he was of fear of being arrested. The government, the Indian agent, wanted Descahe arrested for his activities in Geneva, so he never returned to Canada, and he actually went to Rochester, New York, and then to the Tuscarora Reserve, just across the border from Canada. You could see Canada from the Tuscarora Reserve in the house of the Rickard family, and that house is still there. Descahe became ill, and Canada never. In those days, there was called the pass laws, where you needed the permission of the Indian agent to leave the community, and Descahe became very ill in Tuscarora, and the Canadian government would not allow the family to go visit Discahe when he was ill, and he died very shortly thereafter. I think in April of 2025, and they say he died of a broken heart because of what had happened. And he returned to, and his funeral was in Six Nations. So Discahe has been a symbol of the effort of Indigenous peoples to have a voice at the international level. And 1923, next year, 2023, will be 100 years since Discahe went to the League of Nations, and we're using that as a hallmark, as a goal to for Indigenous peoples to get a status that is equal as possible to states in the United Nations, in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. And as I was the co-chair of the work roundtable on enhanced participation last year in Geneva, and even that was an example of enhanced participation, because it's the first roundtable that the Human Rights Council ever had, and all events of the Human Rights Council are always chaired by the president of the Human Rights Council or a state. And this is the first time that a non-state actor was a co-chair of an event at the Human Rights Council, and it was an example of enhanced participation. And in the conclusions, I put in there that that 1924 is the 100th anniversary of that when Discahe left Geneva, and I challenged the United Nations that Chief Discahe should be able to address the Human Rights Council as a chief of his people and not as an NGO. And so that's the challenge that we've put to the Human Rights Council, that we have to find a solution to Indigenous participation at the Human Rights Council, and then we've given them that deadline. And so it's very convenient that we are coming up with this workshop in November, this 4-day workshop to discuss all the modalities and the who could get the status, etc. So the timing is very, very, very good for us to fulfill that challenge. In the meantime, from 1924 to the present, there has been other Indigenous people that have gone. A gentleman named Ronata from the Maori went to the League, and he was also denied speaking. And another guy named Nelson from Samoa also went to the League in 1928, I think, and he was also rebuffed from speaking at the League. And we've been trying when the Indigenous people came to Geneva in 1977 on the very important NGO conference on racial discrimination against the Indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere. Indigenous peoples there demanded that we have a voice in the United Nations, and we've been demanding that ever since, trying to have a voice in the United Nations. And that effort, resulted in the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, which was first meeting was in 1982, and that was very unique body, because it was that body allowed anybody to address the working group. You didn't have to be a state or an NGO, and that was a groundbreaking. It was the only body in the entire United Nations where that was allowed, and that existed till 2006. So that was a step forward. However, the working group is the lowest level in the United Nations, and you can't get any lower than the working group from the subcommission. And so that status only applied to the working group and did not apply to the subcommission, Commission Human Rights, and today's Human Rights Council, where the only way to address them is by having an NGO status. So we have an opportunity now to make sure that Discahe can and your leadership, the leadership of Indigenous people, can speak at the Human Rights Council that respects that we are governments and that we are institutions that can that have a constituency in our own civil societies. So a small part I left out was that Discahe, the current Discahe, his name is Stephen Jacobs, came to the League of Nations and came to the Human Rights Council in 2019, and he still at that time could not speak, and he stood up in the room when took the floor on the half-day discussion on enhanced participation, and he stood up, and it was so visible to everybody in the room that this man cannot speak for his people, and it was an amazing display of the apartheid that we face in the United Nations. So to us, the symbolism of Discahe is an important aspect of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to accomplish. And I think it symbolizes what Indigenous people, the struggle of Indigenous peoples for recognition in the UN system. So I'm hoping that all of you here and all of us together around the world can influence the Human Rights Council so that our leadership, our people are the people those that represent our peoples, as governments can address the Human Rights Council, by 1924. So I'll end it here this time, and I want to thank you for allowing me to speak. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kenneth, for sharing with us the important history of the enhanced participation process, which did not just start now. And it's good to see that we have many participants who are interested in this process, and working together is the only key on how we can achieve our enhanced participation within the United Nations. Thank you again, Mr. Kenneth. And now we will, before I move to the next speaker, I wanted to remind the participant that if you have questions for Mr. Kenneth, please write them down, even in the chat, or just hold on to them. After the three presenters, we will have time for questions and answers for more clarification in case you have doubts. So now I would like to move to the next presenter. His name is Les Malezer. Les is an Aboriginal activist campaigning for the rights of human rights of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders peoples in Australia, and has wide participation in the human rights of Indigenous peoples at the international level. Now retired, but still active. His career has included senior positions at the national levels in Australia, both representing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders communities, and partaking directly in policy and legislative reforms within the national, state, and local government. His long involvement at the international level has seen roles in Indigenous peoples activists, the United Nations, Commonwealth, ahead of government, and various international organizations over the past 35 years, pursuing acknowledgement of and respect of the right of Indigenous peoples, including a former advisor to the President of the United Nations General Assembly during the negotiations of the World Conference Outcome Document, and co-chair of the Alta preparatory meeting. Mr. Les will focus his presentation on the Alta Conference recommendations, World Conference outcomes, and the resolutions in between. Mr. Les, I would like to give you the floor now.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope my Zoom program is working okay with video and voice. I very much appreciate that introduction, and I'm very happy to say hello to everyone participating in this particular online meeting. It's in terms of background, I think Kenneth has given a very good introduction as to why we're at the stage we're at and why it's still important to continue to push for recognition at the United Nations level, even though we have achieved the major target of getting a declaration in place, and we have every year resolutions for the last 2 or 3 decades addressing Indigenous peoples and calling upon states to respect and promote the rights of Indigenous peoples of the world. However, the Alta conference still remains, I believe, for Indigenous peoples, the statement of what status we want to have in the international community. And when the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples was held, 8 years ago now, the resolution that came from that World Conference that was supported by consensus, it didn't have any votes against the resolution, essentially appears as an action document for states to promote and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples in conjunction with the Indigenous peoples. But that important resolution, which I think is just as important as the resolution to adopt the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, did not include the recommendations that came from the Alta conference for enhanced participation and for improved support and resources from the United Nations. And I believe now that we see the evidence now in 2022 of why those recommendations that were made were so important, because I don't believe that the continued processes and structures of the United Nations are living up to the arrangements and the agreements that we had reached when the Declaration was adopted 15 years ago. At that time, more respect was given to Indigenous peoples and the voice of Indigenous peoples, and more effort was being made to see that equality and justice in the human rights area was being played out. But we have a lot of frustration still occurring at the international level. Personally, for me, one of my very big frustrations has been the fact that the structures that are set up both in Geneva and in New York to support in representations, delegations from Indigenous peoples are not as strong and as forthcoming as they should be. And I'm not blaming necessarily the people that are in those structures, but I do believe that we have seen with more recent appointments to the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples and on the permanent forum on Indigenous issues, strange appointments where nominees who've got very good qualifications for those positions are being overlooked for people who basically have no background and no recognition in the international arena. So again, it's not an attack on any individual person, but really, I believe it's evidence that it's the people behind the scenes in the United Nations and not the Indigenous peoples themselves that are making important decisions and important arrangements in the United Nations. So again, I'll come back just to mention the Alta conference and the documents that we should hold that higher than the declaration and higher than the World Conference outcome document in terms of what Indigenous peoples of the world are wanting to say and achieve at the international level. And that includes the references that Kenneth made about enhanced participation in the General Assembly, the ability to be recognised as peoples holding the right to self-determination, which the UN Charter, from the time it was formed back in 1945, was designed to address, to uphold the rights of peoples in recognition that world conflicts, disagreements, and inequality was based upon the oppression of peoples by dominant societies and nation states. We've seen a lot of changes where it's gone from less than 50 members of the United Nations to now, I think it's 194, maybe more. So there's been a lot of decolonization. There's been a lot of recognition of small states and other groups that have generally been dominated through imperialism has occurred. But Indigenous peoples got lost in that process, particularly in the decolonization process that's in the UN Charter. And then the Trusteeship Council proposal and so on, because Indigenous peoples were not recognised as a peoples, as a population. They were generally regarded as being hidden and buried deep within the nation states, when in fact all the evidence shows that Indigenous peoples continue to survive and operate with autonomy in relation to their territories and in relation to their lifestyles and values, and particularly their aspirations for the future generations. And not least, with now the attention on climate change, Indigenous peoples have a very prominent status in the custodianship of the global environment, natural environment, because it's the territories of Indigenous peoples that are pristine, and the developments, the loss of biodiversity, the damage to the environment has occurred in the areas where Indigenous peoples' territories haven't extended. So, but unfortunately, in the discussions at the United Nations on climate change, Indigenous peoples are essentially forced outside the room into positions of being protesters or complainants or claimants in the process, instead of people involved in making the decisions and making solutions for the promotion, for the preservation of the biodiversity and global natural resources. So I'm very interested in this process that is now, I think it's a coming together, because we have for a number of years now made the approaches through the proper channels, through formalities, to have enhanced participation in the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is a very important assembly, but we have found in the successful campaigns we've had that when it comes to the General Assembly, the doors are closed to our involvement and to our voice. And there's no real defense or justification that states can provide as to why those doors are closed, except to say we are the states, and that only states should have a say. So they're essentially not obeying, not living up to their obligations as members of the United Nations to defend the rights of peoples. They should be saying we are peoples, we are represented as peoples, and of course Indigenous peoples have a role to play. The proposals that have been put forward have not been to push our way onto the floor and demand the microphone, but rather to say, on the matters that do concern Indigenous peoples and will deal with the interests and futures of Indigenous peoples, the Indigenous peoples' voice should be heard. And I just do another reminder, which is in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, following the COBO report, which had gone on for a number of years and produced quite a lot of information and recommendations about who are the Indigenous peoples of the world, what is the status of Indigenous peoples, and so on. So in response to that report, the Declaration has in its preambular statement that we, that is the states, recognise that the issues and interests of Indigenous peoples are a matter of international concern for the United Nations. So regardless of belief that still is held by nation states, that they are the dominant society and that Indigenous peoples are still subservient, even though we're trying to get self-determination. That's preambular statement, and I suggest that you take the effort to go and look through the preamble, because the preamble is basically the foundation. It's basically those things upon which the proactive articles are based on human rights. These are the givens, these are the building blocks on it. And it has that building block to say the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples are a matter of international concern. Well, as both Kenneth and I have been saying to you, if it's a matter of international concern, then there really is no argument as to why Indigenous peoples should not have a way to participate at all levels, including the General Assembly. And I'll add even there the Third Committee, because there are problems in the Third Committee, which does prepare, discuss and draft the resolutions for the General Assembly, mostly with the intention of having consensus support. So it's basically, those resolutions are really saying these are the bottom line of what should be happening, not the ceiling, but the floor of what should be happening. So the Third Committee itself, and probably other committees can get brought into this argument, is just as important, which is the workshop of where General Assembly business is carried out prior to adoption of resolutions in the General Assembly. I have followed the work that's been going on about enhanced participation, particularly when I was in New York, working on the preparation of the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples. I participated as much as I could in the other meetings that were happening. I've worked and talked closely with Claire Charters, who's done a marvelous job in that discussion and preparing documentation and being an intermediary between Indigenous peoples in the States. That Claire Charters, Professor Claire Charters from the Maori community, has done such wonderful work with keeping this issue on the table. It hasn't been allowed to be removed from the table and put away, but it's still there. But some progress has to be made. And hopefully with this effort that I see developing now to see progress being made, we should be able to take it another level, and we should be able to make some inroads on that whole thing. So I'm very pleased to put aside my focus on domestic issues back here in Australia of getting rights of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people recognised in law, to again take up the sort of campaigning that's necessary at the international level to achieve those things that have been already established in the Alta document, for improvement in the structures, for higher appointments in the bureaucracy of Indigenous persons or persons coming from the delegations of Indigenous peoples in there, and also the enhanced participation at all levels of the United Nations. Fortunately, we haven't yet pushed for a veto power in the Security Council, but it's interesting to see in the current climate the fact that there's suggestions that the Security Council should take, the General Assembly should take dominance over the United Nations and not allow the Security Council to be used by major powers as a way of controlling global governance and global interests in that. Finally, before I just finish up this presentation, I'm sorry to have taken too long, but I do want to say that we have a wonderful new development here in Australia. We've just had elections and change from a Conservative government to a government that is swearing its support for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia and for Indigenous peoples of the world. And our Minister for Foreign Affairs recently at the General Assembly made that quite clear in the statement to the General Assembly, how Australia wants to play now very much a proactive role in promoting and protecting rights of Indigenous peoples around the world. And in confirmation of that, they are now seeking to establish a diplomat for First Nations. So a diplomat that will deal at the global level on the issues of Indigenous peoples, basically representing the standards for Indigenous peoples that has been adopted at the international level and so on. I see that as being a very useful instrument to be developed there. Of course, I think the primacy always rests with Indigenous peoples themselves and not states representing or acting without regard for Indigenous peoples. But I think that this effort by the Australian government should be a great benefit, including they have already expressed support for this issue of enhanced participation and will be part of the argument coming forward from Indigenous peoples to see the important changes. So I'm very pleased that that's happening. I actually am in Canberra at the moment, the capital of Australia, which was a 14-hour drive for me to be here to meet with Foreign Affairs staff today to talk about these sorts of plans and intentions, and we've agreed to have a continued discourse and to try and get the best arrangements through this proposal by the government to appoint a diplomat for First Nations. So thank you very much. And again, I'm pleased to be able to participate in these gatherings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Les, for sharing with this very important history, starting from the Alta document onto to the World Conference. It's really nice to know that Australia is a strong supporter of the Indigenous peoples in terms of the enhanced participation. And I would also want to mention that for the participants to take note of the documents, that agreements or resolutions that you mentioned, where it's highlighted the importance of enhanced participation with the UN. I also see Ghazali, sorry for the background noise. I also see Ghazali has shared some links in the chat. Please, to understand better the process, please go to the links, read about the enhanced participation process, as well as the documents supporting the process. Now I would like to move to our next speaker. Our final presenter is Mr. Ghazali Ohorella. Ghazali is the Indigenous Coordinating Body member from the Pacific region, and he is also the Executive Secretary of the Indigenous Coordinating Body. He will take you through the enhanced participation journey since the World Conference and the steps the United Nations and Indigenous peoples have taken so far. So it's a pleasure for me to welcome Mr. Ghazali.
Thank you so much, Aminatu, for the introduction, and also Kenneth, and as well as Les for giving the very comprehensive background information in terms of the lead up, the why behind the enhanced participation process, and the Sky High journey has sparked many. Many plates and many missions of Indigenous peoples at the international level. I'll attempt to describe to you the journey of the enhanced participation process in terms of the steps that have been taken. Les just now mentioned he had a 14-hour drive to Canberra. Like if I explain to you the whole thing, the steps that led up to the point where we are, then I would talk nonstop for 14 hours and then some, but I'll try to keep it brief to give you the highlights of the steps that have been taken at the UN level when it comes to the enhanced participation process, so that we're all on the same page. We heard Les and Kenneth talk about the enhanced participation process and status of Indigenous peoples. As many, if not most of you know, that there's only one participatory status or category that exists that Indigenous peoples can use right now, which is generally the non-governmental, as that of non-governmental organizations. However, under the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the UN Permanent Forum, there's this modality of Indigenous peoples organizations that Indigenous peoples can use. However, in most cases, it's that of an NGO. which does not accurately reflect the status of indigenous peoples as self-governing peoples. So, for example, like Kenneth talked about, if the Haudenosaunee Diskahe wants to address the United Nations in its capacity as a leader of a sovereign and self-determined peoples, this Diskahe would have to become a delegate of a non-governmental organization, and that would be unjustified. It's not in line with self-determination, and because indigenous people have so many perspectives and that have developed since time immemorial, we can bring unique voices to peace and other global issues. So that's in terms of status. The other problem is that most times the voices of indigenous peoples remain unheard because we can only speak on quote unquote indigenous issues. So whenever there's a process that has the word indigenous in it, then we can participate. However, the current opportunities where we can speak in are not adequate for indigenous peoples wanting to participate in global issues and wanting to contribute to global issues. So when we talk about the enhanced participation process and the steps taken, they're all based on one thing, and Les talked about it before, is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That is our starting point. That is our minimum standard. So building on the UN Declaration and the studies that are proposed from indigenous peoples, for example, the 2014 World Conference outcome document, definitely the Alta outcome document, the UN started to commit to consider ways to enable the participation of indigenous peoples representatives in institutions. So we're mostly talking about indigenous peoples representative institutions like governments, parliaments, assemblies, councils. Those are the institutions that we're talking about and at the NS participation process. So when in 2015, I'll take you down memory lane a little bit. In May 2015, the UN Secretary General, he outlined the consideration to be addressed for enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples. And then in December 2015, the General Assembly requested the President of the General Assembly to conduct consultations on possible measures necessary, like procedural and institutional steps, to address enhanced participation, and it was all part of this World Conference outcome document. So, and then we skip a couple of months actually. In February 2016, then when the President of the General Assembly appointed 4 advisors to assist him in carrying out consultations on this topic of enhanced participation. When it comes to advisors, it is very important that it is in line with Article 18 of the Declaration, right to participate in decision-making processes, which we've also affirmed, for example, when we had an indigenous co-facilitator to conduct consultations on the modalities of the World Conference. There was a state co-facilitator, His Excellency Luis Afonso de Alba, and Mr. John Henriksen from the Sami people. And they were conducting consultations on behalf of the President of the General Assembly with member states as well as indigenous peoples. So this is a modality that we keep using to ensure that indigenous peoples are continuously being consulted in matters that affect them, which includes, for example, the enhanced participation process. Co-facilitators back then, and starting with Les as an advisor, we started to see advisors, that role come up. So we had 4 advisors, 2 one from Finland and 1 from Ghana. And like Les said, 2 indigenous, Dr. Claire Charters from Aotearoa, and Professor James Anaya, who many indigenous peoples know. So with the support of these 4 advisors, he conducted 1 electronic consultation and 3 face-to-face consultations with indigenous peoples and member states. And they provided a compilation of views in mid-July 2016. And then in September 2016, the PGA reappointed these 4 advisors again, because he had a new President of the General Assembly to continue the consultations of improving indigenous people's participation at the UN. Now, 2016, 2017, that's a process that Indigenous peoples saw the enhanced participation process mainly at the General Assembly level. So when Indigenous peoples met in Thailand, so there's a dialogue meeting amongst Indigenous peoples to reassess and to consolidate, like how are we going to look at the enhanced participation process from this point onwards. There was some developments at the General Assembly level. There was a lot of pushback at the General Assembly level. And how are we going, as Indigenous peoples, going to approach that? So the dialogue meeting, the Bangkok dialogue meeting had an outcome document, which is one of the links that you see below in the chat. It's attached to under resources. You can read up on the outcome document of the Bangkok meeting. And then they started to continue the consultations on the resolution and a textual resolution, and there were consultations held in the margins of the Pyramid Forum from 2016 and into 2017. And then in 2017, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on enhancing participation and welcoming discussions on participation at the Pyramid Forum. The expert mechanism started to talk about enhanced participation as well, and a special rapporteur started to also discuss enhanced participation. And it further requested the Secretary General to report by the end of that assembly session on achievements, analysis, and recommendations on ways to enable the participation of Indigenous peoples. Then what we saw that one of the mandates of the President of General Assembly was to conduct 3 informal interactive hearings starting in 2018. So the idea was to have one in 2018, one in 2019, and one in 2020. And these hearings were requested by the General Assembly resolution, and it was open. They were open to the Indigenous participants accredited to the sessions of the Pyramid Forum, because to ensure that the broadest participation possible of Indigenous peoples, these interactive hearings were mostly held in the margins of the Pyramid Forum, which is held in New York. So that was the first. The hearing was held in 2018. And then you started to see that the Human Rights Council, so you had the General Assembly level, and then you see also the Human Rights Council level start to discuss as well the enhanced participation. For example, in the 11th session of the MRIP, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2018, started to propose to the Human Rights Council to make further efforts to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples representatives and their institutions. Again, in accordance with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that was in July in 2018. Usually in September of the same year, the Human Rights Council starts to consider the annual resolution on human rights and Indigenous peoples and the reports of the expert mechanism. So in September of the same year, the Human Rights Council decided to hold a half-day intersessional dialogue on enhanced participation. The irony is, and this is what kind of talked about, it would have been held in the margins of the expert mechanism. That would happen in the next year, in 2019. The session that was the dialogue that was organized by the Human Rights Council was a Human Rights Council meeting, which has Human Rights Council participatory modalities. So the only way you can participate with the Human Rights at the Human Rights Council is as a NGO, is that you have an NGO as with ECOSOC status. So that really does not help the enhanced participation process, because you did see the MRIP had a closed session, and during that session, the Human Rights Council started to have this roundtable discussion, but was only open to states and NGOs that have ECOSOC status. So that's why when Kenneth talked about like this guy still couldn't talk in his own capacity, that was in that meeting. The that was at the Geneva level at the Human Rights Council. And 2019 as well, the President of General Assembly, this is back in New York, conducted the second of the three interactive hearings. And then you saw the two processes started moving forward, one at the General Assembly level and one at the Human Rights Council level. And then what you did see is that, so furthering the process at the Human Rights Council, we start to have another dialogue on intersessional roundtable on NS participation. You did see, however, that it wasn't necessarily a negotiation process. It was from event to event to event at the Human Rights Council level to continue the discussion on NS participation. So there wasn't really a negotiation process or a substantial process ongoing. And then in 2020, another meeting was held, organized by Indigenous Peoples. So the first meeting was held in Bangkok. The second meeting was held in Quito, Ecuador. And at that meeting, not only Indigenous Peoples, but also states were invited to discuss how to move forward with enhanced participation process. And in that same meeting, the Indigenous Coordinating Body was established to ensure that Indigenous Peoples started to consolidate and started to participate in the enhanced participation process. Obviously, COVID happened. In May 2021, the President of General Assembly wanted to hold another session of the interactive hearings, but because the Perm Forum was closed or hybrid, either way, it could not ensure the broadest participation possible of Indigenous Peoples. So the first thing that this coordinating body did was to ask for the postponement of that meeting. Because there is no way that Indigenous Peoples could physically attend that meeting, and you heard it many times before. Nothing about us without us. So you can't have a consultation on NS participation without broad representation of Indigenous Peoples. So that was in 2020 and 21. The President of General Assembly wanted to host the third round hearing again, and still there was the coordinating body said still, even though it is hybrid, it has not the possibility for Indigenous Peoples to really participate meaningfully and effectively in the process. So we again request for postponement. So and it's likely that the last hearing that needs to be done by the President of the General Assembly will be held at the Perm Forum next year. So we're coming to where we are at right now. Kenneth talked about this intersessional roundtable that he participated in 2021, and that's actually one of the recommendations was to a 4-day expert workshop on enhanced participation. And now that you see there's a workshop that will be held from November 21st until 24th at the United Nations in Geneva on enhancing the participation of Indigenous Peoples at the Human Rights Council. And there are 4 major topics: venues of participation, modalities of participation, the selection criteria, and selection mechanism that will be discussed. The workshop itself is not necessarily a negotiation session as in terms of substance, but it is a kickoff to the process itself, to establish a negotiation process that can eventually lead to a consultation process about the details of these 4 topics I just mentioned, resulting in a standalone resolution, hopefully at the anniversary of the Descahe in 2024 in September. That's what we're aiming for. So this workshop is key, and you're all participating in this dialogue. Also hoping that we can inform you in a way so that you can participate meaningfully in the workshop, and that you can come prepared to the workshop. There's a deadline for submissions, which is October 31st. And so we have created a sequence of meetings, of these dialogues, 5 meetings in total. So 1 introductory and 4 meetings. 1 will be dedicated to each agenda item, so that you have enough knowledge and value and capacity to submit your views before October 31st. So that is, in short, the roadmap or the steps taken of the enhanced participation process so far. Thank you so much, Aminatu.
Thank you very much, Ghazali. That is a lot of information. You've shared with us the journey so far, starting from the World Conference until now. I know for some people who are just starting the process, following the process now, it's a lot of information, but please go to the chart and you see the link that Ghazali has shared. You'll be able to understand step by step all the information that Ghazali has shared. But also, if you have question and answers, we are moving to the next session. But before then,
my friends, you can now also listen to the Go Maluku podcast on Spotify. Listen while you use other apps or do other things. If you don't have Spotify, just open your Apple or Google podcast or your favorite podcasting app and search for the Go Maluku podcast.